The Civil War soldiers of Branford and North Branford was many years in the making. It is 557 pages, includes biographies of nearly 450 soldiers, and has over 400 photographs and illustrations. There were 18 soldiers from Stony Creek who served in 8 different regiments. Many sources were used to gather information on the soldiers, published war records, newspapers, Civil War books, gravestones, vital records, and family genealogies. The primary source was from the pensions the soldiers or their families received during and after the war. I made a number of trips to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and researched over 200 Branford pensions. The pensions contain a history of the soldier's service, biographical data including vital records, physical description, occupation, residence, and family information. My aim was to chronicle all of Branford's Civil War soldiers and to tell the soldiers' stories through their own words about their service, families, and how the war affected their lives. Stony Creek is mentioned in the book many times. The Stony Creek of 1860 was very different from what we know today. There were about 30 families here year-round with a population of about 200. The railroad came through in 1852, bringing many changes over the next few decades. The summer resort era had started in the late 1840s, but had not yet reached its heyday. Yet to come were the many cottages built along the shore and on the islands. There was no Prospect Hill or Flying Point Road or the other side streets in Stony Creek Village. There were 4 hotels already: the Stony Creek or Douglas House, now the site of the Stony Creek Church of Christ, 1 hotel on Pot Island, the 3 Elms Hotel, and the Indian Point House. The latter 2 were operated by the Coe family. There was a little red schoolhouse on Leeds Island Road, but there was no church yet. Benjamin Green had established Stony Creek's first quarry in 1852 across from the Willoughby Wallace Library, and yes, there were some saloons. Farming and fishing remained the main occupations. Some of the families were the Rogers family on Sachem Road and Leeds Island Road toward Guilford. Gilbert Bush and Jasper Cook lived on Bush's Neck, later called Vedder or Pleasant Point. Dennis Page, Timothy Barker, and the Hall family were living at Hall's Point. The Frisbie family was on Thimble Islands Road, or Main Street as it was then called, and the Tuckers were on Flat Rock. The Howd family were original settlers of Stony Creek and built this first house in the village. Also here was the engraver, Richard Paine, and Polly Palmer and her family were out on Pave Street. The causes of the War of the Rebellion were complex and had simmered for many years. Slavery was only one of them. The war began with the firing at Fort Sumter and the Union surrender on April 12, 1861. The first battle of Bull Run was on July 21st of that year. It was soon realized the conflict would not be over quickly. Stony Creek men, along with those from Branford, responded to President Lincoln's call for troops, and most enlisted in the summer and fall of 1862, more than a year after the war had begun. The men received a bounty from the state of Connecticut of $300, and Branford provided support for the men and their families in the form of money and articles of clothing in addition to their federal pay. There were public meetings, sermons, posters, recruiters, and bounties, all to entice the young man to enlist. Their reasons for enlisting were many. Foremost was saving the Union, but also adventure, money, and being with their friends. For Branford men, the issue of slavery was probably not among them. Many men did not enlist. They needed to run their family farm. They had family and health reasons. Some were opposed to the war or feared fighting. Less than half of Branford's eligible men actually served in the war. 7 Stony Creek men enlisted in the summer of 1862 in the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, a 9-month regiment. 5 of them, Elizur Dibble, Roger Hall, John Hotchkiss, Bradley Palmer, and Lewis Tucker, all enlisted in Company B, which was Branford's hometown company. Company B was mustered in at Camp Terry in Fairhaven on October 2, 1862, where they received their equipment and were trained in discipline and military skills. Townspeople visited the camp often, and women brought food and made the flags for the regiments. Diseases such as measles plagued the camp. Lewis Tucker of Flat Rock was 25 years of age and enlisted in Company B. While on guard duty at Camp Terry in New Haven, he contracted typhoid fever. He was sent home, where he died 8 days after being mustered into service. He is buried in Damascus Cemetery, and his name is listed on Stony Creek's Veterans Monument. His mother received a pension because Lewis helped support the family. At the end of October, the 27th left on the steamer Quaker City for New York and boarded the train for Washington, D.C., arriving on the 25th. They marched across the Chain Bridge into Arlington Heights, Virginia, where the Army of the Potomac had taken over Robert E. Lee's house and peach orchard, now the site of Arlington Cemetery. The first night it was rainy and cold, weather that would occur during much of the winter, and many men became ill. By the end of November 1862, 39,000 Union soldiers camped in Northern Virginia were sick with typhoid fever and other illnesses. At camp, they continued their military training. The last day of November 1862, not quite 2 months after enlisting, the 27th marched 50 miles south in a driving rain that turned to snow and arrived at Falmouth, Virginia on December 9th. 2 days later, the 27th camped on the bare ground on the Rappahannock River opposite Fredericksburg. Merwin Wheaton of North Branford wrote home that cannonading was heard day and night that probably has never been heard on this continent. On December 12, 1862, 375 men of the 27th, including Company B, crossed over into Fredericksburg. Henry Boardman of Branford was a private in Company B. He wrote, "We got up at 5 in the morning and ate our breakfast of raw pork and hard bread. The day was chilly and foggy. As we moved through the streets, a murderous fire of grape, canister, shot, and shell was opened upon us. Several men from the 27th were killed." Under orders, the 27th was marched at double time 1,500 yards up Mary's Height, where at the crest were Confederate fortifications. The ranks of the 27th were decimated by the enemy. Merwin Wheaton remembered, "I then began to realize the horrors of a battlefield, the groans of the wounded, the thunder of shells all mixed together, and 3 or 4 men blown all to pieces by a shell within a few feet from me. 1/3 of the 27th were killed or wounded, including 4 from Company B. The battle was a horrible defeat for the Union." On December 15th, under the cover of night, the Army of the Potomac retreated back across the Rappahannock River. The 27th built the temporary pontoon bridges and were the last ones back over, dismantling them as they went. The 27th spent the winter back at camp at Falmouth, just west of Fredericksburg. There was more stormy weather, including a severe snowstorm. Each soldier was assigned to picket duty every 2 weeks for 2 days. During this dreaded duty, they were exposed to the elements with little shelter. Men became ill from dysentery, fever, and lung problems. That winter, many soldiers deserted. 4 months after Fredericksburg, on April 8, 1863, President Lincoln visited the camp at Falmouth and reviewed the troops. Less than 1 month later, the 27th, along with other Union regiments, were marched 10 miles west and fought in the Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia, on May 3, 1863. After intense fighting in a heavily wooded area, the 27th was surrounded by a Georgia regiment, and 280 men, including 38 from Company B, were taken prisoner. Over a 6-day period in extreme heat, the prisoners were marched over 60 miles to Richmond, Virginia. Many were placed in Libby Prison, a former tobacco warehouse. Some of the soldiers were in poor condition and had to be helped or carried by their comrades. The conditions in the prison were terrible. Fortunately, they were exchanged and paroled 4 days later. After their release from prison, the men were sent to Camp Convalescent in Alexandria, Virginia, where they spent the rest of their term. Only 75 members of the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry were left and went on to fight at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863. The men from Camp Convalescent and the few remaining after the Battle of Gettysburg met at Baltimore and took the train home. The 27th was discharged on July 18, 1863, when their 9-month term expired. They arrived in New Haven on July 22nd to a parade and an enthusiastic welcome. Only 2 of the soldiers re-enlisted in other regiments. Roger Hall was 37 years of age with a wife and a daughter when he enlisted in Company B of the 27th. Just before the Battle of Fredericksburg, he was sent to the hospital with acute rheumatism, an illness that plagued the soldiers. He was in the hospital for his entire term of duty and did not fight in any of the battles. He returned to Stony Creek, where he had an express and oyster business. He received a pension in 1890 and was described as 5 feet 10 inches tall, rather tall for that time. Roger Hall died in 1905 and is buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. His wife, Eliza Page, died in 1908. Roger Hall was the brother-in-law of soldier Richard Paine. Elizur Dibble of Company B was 20 years old and lived on Pave Street, now the home of the Lasco family. He fought at the Battle of Fredericksburg and was captured at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Though he never applied for a pension, it appears he was never well after the war, suffering from rheumatism that prevented him from working. Dibble died in 1891 and is buried in Damascus Cemetery. Elizur Dibble was married in 1864 to Anne Meggs of Guilford. This tintype is not identified, but since it came from the Vedder family who were related to the Dibbles, I am almost certain it is Elizur and Anne, probably on their wedding day. On her lap is his Civil War kepi with a bugle signifying a infantry unit, 27 for his regiment and B for his company. John Hotchkiss was from Stony Creek and 44 years of age. When he enlisted in Company B, he had a wife and 5 children. These older men often did not fare well. He became ill after the Battle of Fredericksburg and was sent to the hospital, where he remained for the rest of his term. He died at his home in 1864 as a result of the illness contracted during the war and is buried in Damascus Cemetery. His wife was Georgiana Tucker, sister of the soldier Lewis Tucker. She was married second in 1869 to Samuel Cook. Georgiana died in 1898 and is buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. Alice, the daughter of John and Georgiana Hotchkiss, married Robert Ashman, a Civil War soldier from New York who settled in Stony Creek. Also in Company B was Bradley Palmer. This photograph was taken after he enlisted and 2 days before he was mustered in. He is holding his Civil War hat. He was also rather tall. He was left behind sick before the Battle of Fredericksburg, but did fight at Chancellorsville, where he was captured with the rest of the regiment. He received a pension in 1890, where he states that he was in the hospital after Fredericksburg because of frozen feet due to extreme marching and exposure. Like many of his fellow soldiers, he was a member of Branford's Mason Rogers Post, Note Number 7 of the Grand Army of the Republic. Bradley Palmer was born and died in the same house on Pave Street, now the northern end of Leeds Island Road. This house was torn down when I-95 was put through in the 1950s. Palmer died in 1906 and is buried in Center Cemetery in Branford. His wife, Bessie Foote, died in 1921. They did not have any children. 2 men from Company A of the 27th Infantry came to Stony Creek after the war. William H. Barnes of New Haven fought at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Right after the war, he bought Pot Island, one of the Thimbles, and the family ran the hotel there until 1911. He was known as Billy Barnes, and people said he was a jolly good fellow. Franklin Bradley was also in Company A and was sick from the time the regiment reached Virginia and spent most of his service in the hospital. He came to Stony Creek in 1864 and stated in his pension that he could only do light work, taking on boarders and renting boats. Bradley was a charter member of the Mason Rogers Post, Number 7. He was also one of the founders of the Stony Creek Drum Corps. He was the grandfather of Milton and Claire Bradley, whom some of you may remember. Franklin and his wife Martha are buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. 3 men from Stony Creek enlisted in Company K of the 6th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, which was a 3-year regiment. One was Joseph Barker of Holles Point. The regiment served in Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Virginia, and fought in many battles. Barker was killed at the Battle of Drury's Bluff, Virginia, in May of 1864. A monument for him is in Damascus Cemetery. William Theodore Howd was also in Company K of the 6th Regiment and was later transferred to the 1st U.S. Artillery. He always lived in Stony Creek and after the war was a charter member of the Branford Battery. He died in 1909 and was buried in Stony Creek Cemetery without a gravestone. The Stony Creek Cemetery Association placed a government-issued stone on his gravesite in 2005. Richard Paine also enlisted as a private in Company K of the 6th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry for a term of 3 years. He was soon promoted to corporal and later to sergeant. Before the war, he was a member of the 2nd Company Governor's Foot Guard. He was the brother-in-law of Stony Creek soldier Roger Hall. Paine contracted several ailments during the war, including malaria, at Petersburg, Virginia in 1864. After his discharge, he returned to Stony Creek and was a charter member of Post Number 7. He received a pension in 1884 because of illnesses contracted from the war, and it appears he was never well again. Richard Paine died in 1891. His wife was Maria Page, who died in 1935 at the age of 97. She was for many years the postmistress of Stony Creek. They are both buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. A few others from Stony Creek served in other regiments. Austin Bishop of the 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry died in 1863 of disease, and Winthrop Knight enlisted in the 13th and died in camp. The gravestone seen here at Damascus Cemetery is for Malachi Bush. He was a private in the Connecticut 1st Heavy Artillery. He was captured at Cold Harbor, Virginia in 1862 and died in prison from typhoid fever. The Bush family lived at Pleasant Point. His brother Timothy Bush survived the war. Charles H. Frisbie was born in Stony Creek in the Colopy House, but moved to North Branford before the war and served in the 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. He was wagon master of over 1,000 horses and wagons at New Bern, North Carolina. He is buried in Center Cemetery. Here in this picture, he wears his GAR medal proudly. Captain Henry Page was born in Guilford of Stony Creek parents. He was a musician in the 7th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry and was wounded in the shoulder at Drury's Bluff. He came to Stony Creek after the war and was a boat captain, bringing people to and from the islands. Him and his wife, Emma, are buried in Hartford. Another soldier who came to Stony Creek after the war was Amos Roberts, Jr. He was a native of Maine and served as a private in the 20th Maine Regiment, where he was born. He fought at the Battle of Gettysburg and was discharged, and he reenlisted, serving in Virginia until his term expired in 1865. He came to Connecticut after the war and died in Stony Creek in 1926. He was active in the Mason Rogers Post No. 7, but also in the state and national Grand Army of the Republic organizations. His wife, Kitty Record, died in 1952 at the age of 89. They are buried in Damascus Cemetery. Their daughter, Hazel, married Alexander Greenwall of Stony Creek. Two men are buried in Stony Creek Cemetery who did not serve from here or live here. Elias Norton was from Guilford and served in the Connecticut 1st Light Artillery. He saw action at the battles of Drury Bluff, Bermuda Hundred, Deep Bottom, and Petersburg, Virginia. 40 of his letters to home are at the Guilford Free Library, and he writes in 1862 to his parents, "Your advice in requesting me to seek salvation shows that you have a great desire in my welfare. Allow me to thank you for your kind advice. The army is a very trying place for a young man, for there are all sorts of temptations and evil companions all around him. I have not had a drop of liquor since we came here, and I don't expect to again." Elias Norton is buried here because his in-laws, though from Leeds Island, bought a plot and are buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. A mystery soldier, James A. Noulen, died in 1883 at the age of 52 and is buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. There is very little information for him except a sparse notice of his death in the Branford Vital Records, which gives his age and his birthplace is Ireland. A Masonic symbol is on his gravestone. By 1935, a Grand Army of the Republic flag marker was by his grave, and a Confederate and American flag are placed at his gravesite each year. No evidence of service in either army could be found. The last soldier who had Stony Creek ties is Benjamin Jepson. Before the Civil War, he was active in the anti-slavery movement and was lieutenant of the Independent Rangers in 1855. 2 years later, he was captain in Henry Ward Beecher's Rifle Company, organized at North Church in New Haven, which advocated making Kansas a free state. He enlisted in the Civil War as captain of Company K of the 10th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry and was wounded at Roanoke Island, North Carolina. After the war, he was active in the Admiral Foot Post, Grand Army of the Republic of New Haven. Benjamin Jepson was one of the first primary school music teachers in the country, serving the city of New Haven school system for 48 years. He was a composer, professor at Yale, and author of the standard text for music instruction used by schools for many years. 2 schools in New Haven were named for him. In 1874, Benjamin Jepson bought Burr Island, one of the Thimbles. The family owned the island until 2003. Benjamin Jepson died in 1914, the last surviving officer of the 10th Regiment. After the war, many of Stony Creek's soldiers were charter members of the Mason Rogers Post No. 7 Grand Army of the Republic, also called the GAR for short. The post was named for their comrade Mason Rogers of the 15th Regiment, who died of yellow fever at New Bern, North Carolina. Post No. 7 held meetings, marched in parades, attended dedication of Civil War monuments throughout the state, placed flags on their comrades' graves, and held reunions until their numbers dwindled. The town of Branford, its citizens, and the Mason Rogers Post No. 7 erected the Soldiers or GAR monument on the Branford Green in 1885, which reads, "In honor of her brave sons who fought in the War of the Rebellion." On Stony Creek's village green are two monuments listing those who served from this community in the Revolution, Civil War, and later conflicts. Of 18 Stony Creek Civil War soldiers, 10 were born or served from here, 6 came after the war. 1 soldier died in prison, 5 died of disease, and 1 died in battle. Several soldiers are buried or have monuments in Damascus Cemetery. Most are buried in Stony Creek Cemetery, where every Veterans and Memorial Day, flags are placed on their graves to honor their service.